Florence, 16th century. The main square of the city is packed with a crowd. Nobles watching from the windows, soldiers lining the sides, and in the center, men in colorful outfits fighting over a ball with their feet, their knees, their elbows, whatever it takes. No real rules, no referee with a whistle, no VAR. This was not a street game. It was an official spectacle, sponsored by the elite, painted by artists, recorded for posterity. And here is the curious part. Before football even had a name, before the rules were written down in English on an afternoon in London in 1863, the world was already playing, and artists were already watching. What we are about to see spans from the Italian Renaissance to New York pop art, from Picasso to Warhol, from a self-taught elderly man who painted stadiums on wood to one of the greatest names in Russian suprematism. They all looked at the same game, and they all saw something completely different. Before football existed as we know it, there was organized chaos, Calcio Fiorentino, that brutal and elegant game that took over the squares of Florence in the 16th century. Was not exactly what you would watch on a Sunday afternoon with a beer in your hand. It was closer to a choreographed battle. 27 players on each side, one ball, and near unlimited permission to use your body. Punches were legal. Elbows, too. The objective was to get the ball to the opposite end of the square. Simple as that, violent as that. And even so, or perhaps precisely because of that, the artists were there. There is an anonymous painting from the 16th century that records a calcio match at Piazza Santa Croce in Florence. It is not a technically revolutionary work, but it is a document. A window open onto a world where sport and spectacle were already the same thing, where the elite paid to watch and artists paid to record. A few decades later, in the 17th century, something equally fascinating appears. An illustration of a calcio player in his official uniform. Feathered hat, blue vest, puffy trousers. He looks more like a Renaissance theater actor than an athlete. And perhaps that was exactly it. The game was performance. The field was a stage. After that, a long silence in art. Football, or its primitive versions, kept being played in the streets, almost on the fields in English schools. But artists were looking elsewhere. The Industrial Revolution was happening. Cities were growing. And modern football was taking shape in the hallways of British universities. It was in 1863, in London, that the Football Association established the first official rules of the game. That moment separated football from rugby, defined what feet could and could not do, and created, without knowing it, the most popular sport the world has ever seen. But artists still had not paid real attention. That changed in 1895 when a British painter named Charles Ernest Hemy recorded a match between Sunderland and Aston Villa. It is considered one of the first paintings of a modern football match. The muddy field, the makeshift stands, the players in striped uniforms. Everything there has the raw texture of a Saturday afternoon in the north of England. Hamy was not a name from the Louvre. He was a competent realist painter with eyes for everyday life. And at that moment, everyday life was playing football. What stands out is not the quality of the work, it is what it represents. Art was beginning timidly to accept that the game of the masses deserved a place on canvas. But acceptance and enthusiasm are different things, and the real enthusiasm, the kind that generates works that go to museums, that provoke debates that last, that was still to come. And it came from a place no one expected, not from London, not from Paris. It came from Rome, but not the Rome of football. Ancient Rome. From an architect and engraver of the 18th century who never saw a round ball in his life, but who left a record that any student of stadiums needs to know. Giovanni Battista Piranesi, in 1756, published an engraving detailing the Stadium of Domitian, the space that would become, centuries later, Piazza Navona. There was the architectural DNA of every stadium the world would ever build. The stands, the oval field, the crowd imagined in the stone archways. Piranesi did not know he was drawing the future of football, but he was. And that is one of the most intriguing things about this whole story. Sometimes art documents what does not yet exist. Sometimes it arrives first. The 20th century began with the world in turmoil. Art was exploding in movements that contradicted, provoked, and destroyed each other. Impressionism was already being buried by the post-impressionists. Cubism was dismantling reality into fragments. Futurism wanted to burn everything that came before. And football, that game growing in the streets of Liverpool, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo, was beginning to appear on the canvases of artists who had never set foot on a pitch. The first to arrive was Henri Rousseau. Rousseau was a customs officer, a civil servant. He started painting late, without academic training, without masters, without the blessing of Parisian galleries. Critics called him naive. He kept painting. In 1908, he produced a work called The Football Players. 4 figures in striped uniforms suspended in an autumn field with that ethereal and slightly unsettling quality that only Rousseau could create. The characters seem to float. The game seems like a dream. Today, that work is at the Guggenheim in New York. The naive customs officer won. 5 years later, in 1913, football met futurism. Umberto Boccioni was the kind of artist who did not want to portray movement. He wanted to be movement. His work, Dynamism of a Soccer Player, does not show a player. It shows what happens inside a fraction of a second when a human body at maximum speed meets a ball. Fragments of color, planes that interpenetrate, pure energy transformed into paint. If you look without knowing the title, you may not see any football at all, but you feel something, a force, an urgency. Boccioni died in 1916 at 33 years old in a horse accident during the First World War. He left that work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the permanent feeling that art lost someone far too soon. After Boccioni, football entered unexpected territory. In 1922, a Mexican painter named Angel Zaraga painted something that the art world took decades to properly recognize. Las Futbolistas showed 3 women, not men, in football uniforms, posing with authority and elegance in front of a field. In 1922, when women's football was banned in several countries, when the idea of a woman in short shorts on a museum canvas was considered, at the very least, provocative, Zaraga did not make this a political manifesto. He did not need to. The work spoke for itself, and it keeps speaking. Because that question about where women are in the history of football and art still does not have a satisfying answer. Shortly after, André Lotte brought Cubism to the pitch. Lotte was French, a professor, a theorist, the kind of artist who thought as much about art as he made it. His football players, painted in the 1920s, decomposed the game into geometric planes, flat colors, bodies that are simultaneously several bodies at several moments. It is football seen from above, from the side, from within, as if the camera had been replaced by a mind that processes everything at once. Lotte is not a name that appears frequently outside specialized circles, but his students included Fernand Léger and the young Alberto Giacometti. When someone like that decides to paint football, it is worth paying attention. And then we reach 1931, and a name that changes everything. Kazimir Malevich was Russian, revolutionary, and the creator of suprematism, a movement that believed art should be reduced to the purest forms: squares, circles, lines. No narrative, no representation, just form and color in space. And yet, Malevich painted athletes. Sportsmany, or athletes, shows 4 human figures side by side, each divided into blocks of solid color: red, black, yellow, blue. No defined faces, no expression. They are less people and more archetypes. The idea of an athlete, not a specific one. It is a work that lives on the border between the human figure and pure abstraction. Malevich was persecuted by the Soviet regime in the last years of his life. His works were confiscated, his school shut down. He died in 1935, practically forgotten within his own country. Today, a single work of his can be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That, too, is a form of controversy. Not the loudest kind, but perhaps the most lasting. While Europe was destroying itself for the second time in 30 years, football kept being played and kept being painted. There is something disturbing about that. The human capacity to maintain rituals of beauty and competition while the world around them collapses. And perhaps that is exactly where art finds its most honest role, not as celebration, as testimony. In 1934, a German artist named Willy Baumeister painted Soccer Player, a human figure reduced to an almost abstract silhouette, black against a background of burnt earth. The player exists as shadow, as absence. Baumeister was embedded in constructivism, a movement that believed in geometry as universal language. But here he does something different. He makes visual poetry with as little as possible. The Nazi regime classified his work as degenerate. His exhibitions were banned. Baumeister hid paintings inside the walls of a varnish factory where he worked to survive. He kept painting in secret. When the war ended, he returned to exhibiting. When he died in 1955, he was a professor at the Stuttgart Academy of Arts and one of the central figures of post-war German art. Baumeister's story is the story of many artists of that period. The silent stubbornness of continuing to create when creating was itself an act of resistance. In the same year that Baumeister was painting his player in Germany, on the other side of the Atlantic, a Brazilian was looking at football in a completely different way. Candido Portinari painted Futebol in 1935. Portinari is the greatest Brazilian painter of the 20th century. Full stop. His works are at the United Nations, in the United States Congress, in museums around the world. But what he did with football was not grand or monumental. It was human, small almost. The work shows children playing on red, arid earth, with a cross in the background, stray animals, the open horizon of the Brazilian interior. There is no glamour, no stadium, no crowd. There is dust. There is childhood. There is the specific melancholy of a country that loves football with an intensity that sometimes hurts. Portinari knew what he was doing. He always did. And that work, small among his great canvases, says more about Brazil and football than any trophy ever has. 5 years later, in 1939, a South African painter named Gerard Sekoto recorded something equally revealing. Sekoto was black. Born in a South Africa that did not yet have an official name for apartheid, but was already practicing its logic with cruel precision. His watercolor. The Soccer Players shows a match in a poor neighborhood watched by a woman with a child on her back. The field is dirt. The stands do not exist. The game happens on the margins, geographical, social, political. Sekoto was the first Black South African artist to exhibit in an art gallery in his country. After that, he went into exile in Paris, where he lived until his death in 1993. He never returned to South Africa. His work is not just about football, it is about what happens when an entire people is pushed to the margins and keeps playing anyway. That is the kind of detail that the official history of football rarely tells, and that art preserves with a fidelity no archive can match, because art does not record the score. It records what was around the field when the game was happening. It records who was watching. It records what that game meant to those people at that specific moment in history. And sometimes, only sometimes, that is more important than the final result. There is a kind of love for football that cannot fit in any trophy. It is the love of the fan who wakes up early on a winter Saturday, puts on the heaviest coat they own, and walks miles to the stadium without even knowing if the team will win. It is the love that does not need victory to justify itself. That exists before the opening whistle and continues after the final one. England invented modern football. But more than that, it invented this specific relationship between the game and everyday life. This idea that the stadium is an extension of the street, that supporting your team is a way of belonging. And it was in England that some artists looked at football not as a grand theme, but as a scene from daily life, as human landscape. L.S. Lowry was one of them. Lowry spent hours observing the streets of Manchester and Salford, industrial cities in northern England, gray, dense, full of working-class life. His human figures are known worldwide as matchstick men, small anonymous figures that move in crowds through the urban landscape. In 1953, he painted Going to the Match, a work that today belongs to the English Professional Players Union and has been valued at millions of pounds, not because it is technically virtuosic, but because it captures something that anyone who has ever been to a football match recognizes immediately: the anticipation, the collective movement toward the stadium. That specific moment before the game begins, when the entire city seems to be heading to the same place. Lowry glamorized nothing. There were no heroes on the canvas, just people, just the ritual. In the same year, Robert Tavener produced The Changing Room, a color print that shows players in the locker room before a match. It is an intimate work, almost voyeuristic. Bodies preparing. The game has not started yet, but it is already happening inside the head of each person there. Tavener used the tradition of British printmaking with a modern, almost graphic sensibility. He is not a name that appears in art history textbooks, but that specific work has a rare quality, the ability to show the invisible, what happens before, the silence before the noise. Hubert Andrew Freeth did something similar, but from the outside. His works on football in Watford, both the locker room and the match in the snow, have the specific quality of direct observation. Freeth was a British draftsman and engraver who looked at the world with clinical precision and contained affection. His figures in the snow are almost ghosts. The field barely appears, but the game is there, happening, insisting on existing even under conditions that would keep any sensible person at home. There is something very British about that. This insistence on playing in the mud, in the snow, in the cold, this refusal to let the weather win. And then there is Konstantin Yuon. Yuon was Russian, not British, but his 1956 work, a panoramic view of the newly inaugurated Lenin Stadium in Luzhniki, Moscow, belongs to the same emotional universe. It is a socialist realist painting, yes. Technically, it is propaganda. The Soviet state used art to glorify its achievements. The stadium was one of those achievements. But there is something in the scale of the work, in the way Yuan positioned the observers in the foreground and the stadium in the background, that transcends propaganda. The people in the painting do not look like subjects admiring a state achievement. They look like citizens looking at something that also belongs to them. That distinction is subtle, but it is the difference between art and a poster. Yuan lived 90 years. He survived the revolution, 2 world wars, Stalinism, the thaw, and he kept painting. That persistence, that capacity to keep making art within systems that try to turn art into a tool, is itself a form of silent resistance. Football, in that context, was not just sport. It was the one place where the Russian people could shout without being questioned afterward. And the artists knew that. There is a moment in every conversation about art and football where someone crosses their arms and says, "Fine, but what about the greats? The names that everyone recognizes, even without ever having set foot in a museum." It is a fair question, and the answer exists. Pablo Picasso was not a simple man about anything. His personal life was a minefield. His political opinions were controversial. His relationship with the women he painted is today the subject of serious and necessary revision. But his ability to transform whatever he touched into permanent visual language, that is undeniable. In 1965, at 84 years old, Picasso created Footballeur, not a painting, a sculpture, a white, abstract form that suggests a body in motion without showing any actual body. It is the kind of work that makes half the people say, "This is genius," and the other half say, "This, nothing." and perhaps both are right. What matters is that Picasso, at the end of his life, with all the freedom that 84 years of career bestow, chose to do this. He chose football as a theme, not on commission, not under commercial pressure, by his own will. That says something. It is not entirely clear what, but it says something. 12 years later, in 1977, it was Andy Warhol's turn. Warhol was the opposite of Picasso in almost everything. Where Picasso was dense, Warhol was superficial, but superficial as a mirror, not as emptiness. His works reflect mass culture with a precision that sometimes hurts. Marilyn Monroe, Campbell's soup cans, the electric chair. Always the same gesture, taking something everyone sees and repeating it until the repetition reveals what familiarity was hiding. In 1977, Warhol made a portrait of Pele. The story behind it is less romantic than it sounds. Pele had come to American football. He was playing for the New York Cosmos. In an attempt to popularize the sport in the United States, he needed visibility. Warhol needed a new icon. The two met in a studio in New York, and the result was a silk screen in Warhol's unmistakable style. Flat colors, high contrast. Pele's face multiplied as if he were just another pop celebrity. And there is the controversy that no one needs to shout to feel. Was it art? Was it marketing? Did Warhol know the difference between the two? Did he care? The honest answer is that Warhol built his entire career in exactly that gray area. And Pele, the greatest player of all time, according to practically everyone, became a silk screen on a New York wall, like a soup can. Is that a critique, a tribute, a provocation? It depends on who you ask. And then we come to Fernando Botero. Botero is Colombian. His chubby, voluminous, inflated figures are recognizable anywhere in the world. Museums in New York, Paris, Madrid, and Tokyo hold his works. His sculptures occupy public squares in cities you know. His football shows players with a characteristic volume of the entire Botero universe. Bodies that seem to have been inflated from the inside, moving across the field with an improbable grace given their circumference. It is funny, it is absurd, and at the same time, it has dignity. Botero was never the favorite of contemporary art critics. The avant-garde gallery world always looked at him with a certain reserve. Too popular, too accessible, too figurative in an era that valued the conceptual. But the public, the real public, the one that goes to museums with children on a Sunday, loves Botero. It always has. And that raises a question that art criticism has never satisfactorily answered. Who is art made for? For curators? For collectors? For academics who write dissertations? or for the person who stops in front of an inflated football player in a square in Medellin, laughs, then keeps looking, then comes back the next day? Botero never answered that question directly. He kept painting. He kept sculpting. He died in 2023 at 91 years old with works on practically every continent. Sometimes persistence is the only answer needed. We have arrived at the present, or nearly, and here things get more complicated. Not because art got worse, but because the questions got bigger. The 21st century brought to contemporary art a legitimate obsession with identity, representation, and power. Who is on the canvas? Who is not? Who decided that? And football, the most democratic and at the same time most unequal sport in the world, became the perfect mirror for those questions. Maria Lasnig was Austrian and spent most of her life being ignored by the art world while producing works that are today among the most important of the 20th century. Her Concurrence 3, from the year 2000, shows figures in physical confrontation with an acid, almost hallucinatory palette, neon green, pink, turquoise blue. The bodies interpenetrate, compete, dissolve into one another. Lasnig always said she painted the experience of the body, not how it looks, but how it feels from the inside. In this work, the game is not exactly football. It is the idea of competition, of dispute, of two bodies wanting to occupy the same space at the same time. She received the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale at 92 years old. 92. After decades of being considered secondary by critics who were looking elsewhere. Sometimes art waits, and the weight carries a cost that no prize can cover. Kehinde Wiley came to football by a different path. Wiley is American, black, and became world famous for painting Barack Obama's portrait for the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. His style is unmistakable. Black figures in poses that echo the great portraits of classical European painting, overlaid with intricate ornamental backgrounds inspired by African fabrics and Victorian wallpapers. His work, Arthur, shows a football player, number 10 on his shirt, arms crossed, direct gaze, positioned with the solemnity of a Renaissance king. The background is an African fabric filled with keys repeated in a hypnotic pattern. What Wiley does here is not subtle. It is deliberate. It is political. It is the affirmation that Black bodies deserve the same space of dignity and monumentality that European painting always reserved for white bodies. And he uses football to say that. Because football, perhaps more than any other sport, is the place where Black bodies have been simultaneously celebrated and exploited. Admired on the field, ignored off it. Wiley does not explain this in the work. He does not need to. It is all there. After Wiley, we come to two names that provoke very different reactions depending on who you ask. Jeff Koons is American, a millionaire, and the most expensive living artist in the world at various points in the last decade. His work, which includes balloon sculptures in stainless steel valued at tens of millions of dollars, divides critics almost violently. For some, he is the greatest conceptual artist of contemporary times. For others, he is the greatest marketing scheme in the history of art. His contribution to the football universe is discreet. A drawing of a football on graph paper, simple, almost banal. But it is exactly in that calculated banality that the question lives. Koons always worked with everyday objects elevated to the status of art by the simple gesture of placing them in a different context. A football drawn by Koons is worth more than the annual salary of a professional player in the lower divisions. Is that art? Is that the market? Is it both at the same time? Romero Brito answers that question in a way that Brazilian art criticism has never forgiven. Brito was born in Recife, grew up in poverty, moved to Miami in the 80s, and built a visual empire based on saturated primary colors, simplified geometric shapes, and an almost aggressive joy. His works are in airports, hotels, souvenir shops, and museums. In 2009, he was chosen to create the official poster for the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. In Brazil, that generated an uncomfortable silence in artistic circles. Brito is the most internationally recognized Brazilian artist after Portinari, and at the same time is practically ignored by the critics and art institutions of his own country. The argument against him is always the same. It is kitsch, it is commercial, it is decorative. The argument in his favor is also always the same. He got where he got without anyone's support, from nothing with his own work. Which of the two arguments is more honest? That is a question the Brazilian art world has not yet had the courage to answer out loud. And we close this block with Martin Gordapalota and Sharon Butler, two contemporary artists who came to football from opposite directions. Gordapalota is Argentine. His football diptych mixes near photographic realism with sharp acid humor and precise sociological observation. The crowds, the sweating bodies, the beer bottles, the rival team uniforms sharing the same space. It is football as anthropology, as a study of human behavior in a state of collective passion. Sharon Butler is American. Her work, The Stadium looks at the field from above, from a distance, with an almost conceptual coldness. The players are smudges of color. The field is geometry. The stadium is a structure that exists independently of whoever plays inside it. Two opposite gazes at the same game. One warm, close, sweaty. The other cold, distant, structural. And perhaps it is exactly there, in that tension between those two gazes, that the entire question of this video lives. Is football intimate or monumental? Is it of the people or of the industry? Is it art or is it entertainment? The answer, like almost everything worth having, is both things at the same time. 5 centuries, one game. From the brutal calcio in the squares of Florence to a football drawn on graph paper sold for millions in New York. From children playing on the red earth of the Brazilian interior to a black player portrayed with the solemnity of a Renaissance king. Art did not answer whether football is art. It did something more interesting. It used football to talk about war, resistance, race, class, gender, market, power. It used the most popular game in the world as a language to say what other languages could not. And perhaps that is the answer. Not about football, about art. Art is not what is on the canvas. It is what happens inside the person who looks. If you made it this far, you already know what you think. And the most honest thing now is to ask yourself, what does this game represent in your life? And what would you do if someone turned that into a canvas? If this video made you think, this channel needs you here, subscribe. And in the comments, tell me which work surprised you the most, or suggest the next topic. I am listening.